Welcome to Millennials Meet Liberty, your source for searing hot libertarian takes on the world's weekly headlines. Here's your host, Colt Thompson.
Hey everybody, and welcome to episode number 15 of Millennials Meet Liberty with yours truly, Colt Thompson. Fan-fucking-tastically fired up to be with y'all today, as it is November 20th, 2019. So we're cruising right through the holiday season, just about to hit Thanksgiving Eve. I'm really ecstatic for Thanksgiving this year. I'm actually going to be spending it watching the Dallas Cowboys play the Buffalo Bills in Dallas. So I'm very, very stoked about that. I've never been to a Thanksgiving NFL game, and it's on my bucket list. So it'll surely be checked off, and a hell of a lot of fun next week. So I'm going to stick to the template here and do 2 episodes per week from this point forward. We had a successful launch with our first 10 to 15 episodes, 10 to 14 episodes the past 2 weeks. People are really jumping on here in droves, and it'll be fun to see who sticks with me for the long haul and who I accumulate as followers, because come this time next year, you will surely be listening to the number one podcast in the United States as it pertains to libertarianism, and hopefully the number one podcast in the world for libertarianism. The United States is a bastion of liberty in a sense that there are many libertarians per capita versus that of other countries. I think in the United States, there might have been no such thing as a libertarian right around the 1950s. I think it took Murray Rothbard, arguably the greatest libertarian of all time, to really form and carve out what a libertarian was and stood for. And eventually you had the formation of the National Libertarian Party, which I believe was around 1973 when the United States got rid of its bimetallism and completely off the gold standard. So thank you for joining me. This is, again, going to be the preeminent, best libertarian podcast in the United States for anybody between the ages of 18 to probably 45. This is your one-stop shop for learning everything about liberty and getting the liberty angle for every issues of the current day. So what I want to talk about today is the wonderful world of labor. I want to talk about labor laws and how government, bureaucracy, and politicians have instituted and crafted this insane framework of regulatory apparatuses and labor laws and just specifics around how private sector employers should manage their employees and what type of benefits they should give them and what types of wages they should be offering them and compensation in terms of health insurance, and just telling them how much their employer should get paid if they pay, if they work past a certain amount of hours per day or per week. I mean, just all of these things that government has done to bog down the private sector in the economy and to really just hamper and burden private sector employers from hiring more people and becoming more productive contributors to society, to have really just a better human experience here on the home front in the United States. So I'm going to take some time to smash some myths about labor laws in the United States and regulations and how all of these things came about and why we were convinced in grade school that we needed all of these things, because we simply don't. So I really want to flesh it all out, because you guys are really going to enjoy this episode and learn about, again, labor laws in the United States, how they're not working for us, they're working against us as a population, and how we should really just dismiss them in our own minds as something that are silly and stupid and that we unfortunately have. And to the extent that any politicians are up there trying to regulate any more of the labor force, we should say big fat N-O. That's right, capital N-O. We should accept no further regulations on income of people, wages that are paid by employers, the way employers treat people per se in terms of shift offerings or benefit offerings. I mean, anytime the government gets involved in these things, it's going to destroy the economy, or at least hurt the economy and not let it live up to its full potential. So here we go. Just a few things I want to talk about. I think when you look back at the labor movement in the United States, it really got humming along in the late 1800s, early 1900s. That's when the day of reckoning for all the evil capitalists were, per se, in air quotes, evil capitalists. So what ended up happening was, over time, and this is common in any countries, not just the United States, but countries become more productive. And when they become more productive, they produce more output that the consumer can enjoy. And when consumers are enjoying their living, that is when they're freed up to enjoy maybe a little more leisure time. And when they have some leisure times, they think a little bit about the wrongs of society, and they look at these politicians peddling all of these issues and their quick fixes to all of these issues. And so it kind of backfired on the U.S. that we became so productive in the Gilded Age, gilded meaning everything covered in gold in the late 1800s, 1870s, 80s, 90s, and so on. When we became so productive, people were freed up. So children were able to not have to work anymore, per se, or had to work less. Wives would have to work less or have devices in the home that could assist them in getting their day-to-day chores done more quickly and efficiently. So what was born out of that was a little more downtime and the opportunity to enjoy leisure as a family unit. And of course, when you're having more leisure and you're looking around and you see these politicians talking about the awful things going on in factories or pseudo sweatshops or whatever is going on at the time in the late 1800s, yeah, well, all of a sudden there's going to be this push to have huge swaths of organized labor come to the forefront and then haggle with the government and really get in their ear to come up with things that will fix all of these terrible things that we have wrong and that are so inhumane in the United States during this time of incredible industrial output where we were the envy of the world. So more specifically, we had people like Upton Sinclair coming out of the woodwork as a quote-unquote muckraker or muckraker, however you say that term. And he went into all these factories, he went into all of these pseudo sweatshops, and he kind of did some discovery. And when he did that, he wrote a tell-all book about all of the terrible, unencumbered, just really unadulterated, awful things that were going on and how people were treated and how people were losing limbs and how he was at the meat packing plants and they were shoving arsenic and rat poison into some of this meat as fillers to just send them and put them on the shelves and for the public to consume and pass away, and how it's just this awful industry. So he exposed a lot of things and he shed a light on what was going on during this period of industrialization. Now, this is just common, and not Upton Sinclair per se, but, well, I mean, it's common that he's an opportunist and he wanted to make light of what was going on and or shed some light on what was going on and try to, crystallize it for the public so they could turn around and do something about that, vote for the politician who's going to clean everything up and come in with all of these regulatory agencies to really fix what capitalism has caused, all of these crises and issues of people losing their limbs and meat and produce going out really just filthy and dirty and with whatever the greedy capitalists had at their midst to stuff in the products these days. I mean, this sounds like a Fantasyland type novel, and it kind of is. So I'm not going to say Upton Sinclair was kind of I don't want to say yellow journalist or one of these guys who was spreading propaganda per se, but his whole thing was a little off the beaten path in a sense that when countries go through industrialization, any countries all over the world, surely they're going to go through some aches and pains. So when man was just on the planet with no clothes and they were naked and they were walking around prehistoric times, yeah, they had to do things pretty ruggedly and independently and piecemeal. And as they found out how to roll things, the wheel, and they found out how to use fire, and they found out how to kill animals in the food chain and create clothing out of that, and how to chop down trees and build things that would constitute shelter. When they did these things, their life became easier. And same too came the factory world of the Gilded Age in the United States. So we started erecting all of these factories and churning out all of this output, and all of these children who used to work in farmer agrarian type settings in the agrarian economy quickly ended up working in factories, because not only were we going through industrialization, but we were going through quite amount of urbanization, something that we're kind of seeing in this day and age, but at a faster clip back then. And so really, children went from working in an agrarian economy to working in an industrial economy. So they really shifted all of their hard work and laborious tasks to that of a factory. And that put a lens on everything, because all of these people coming to the factory were from different family units. Whereas if anything was going on that looked kind of shady in the agricultural world in terms of work with the children, well, at least it was kept in the family and it wasn't out there publicized. So Upton Sinclair had a gold mine of information when it came to see how people were being mistreated. But let's ask ourselves, why were the children even in the factories to begin with? Well, the reason they were in the factories is because they had to work. So much like in an agrarian society where they had to work and help out with the family, like having kids was basically an aspect of survival at that point. So the kids would work and they'd milk the cows and they'd till the fields. And when the husbands and the fathers got old enough and had turned over the reins to their children, at least they could have some sort of quasi-retirement, because there's no such thing as guaranteed pensions back there or Social Security. So the children get into these factories and they still necessarily have to work. Well, what's going on is these employers and these greedy, quote unquote, capitalists are providing all of this capital. And with all of this capital equipment, the child is becoming incredibly more productive, yet they're working long hours because, of course, we want to put out more output as a a manufacturing facility and service all these goods all over the economy. So yeah, they're working long hours and occasionally they lost some limbs and some terrible things happened. Well, the question again is, what would they be doing if they weren't working? Well, they would be starving. They wouldn't be eating. Their family would be more poor. Maybe they would be a little more illiterate. I mean, there was issues here with them not working. So they needed to work. It was an aspect of survival. And this is what goes on all over the globe today in third and second world countries, these ones that are developing and becoming first world. All of the children or many of the children in the family unit work, or maybe they don't work quite from when they're 5, but when they're able to work and they can get out there on their own and fend for themselves. So this is just a natural part of capitalism. And yes, there are some casualties in quotes, but again, it's the opposite. Had this been a communistic or socialistic society, there wouldn't have been all of this output for everyone to enjoy all of these products and for the standard of living to rise at all, or for people to be able to work at all, or for people to be able to subsist as long as they did. So in a backwards way, you got to think of it as, oh my God, I mean, we are grateful that the children were able to even work, because them working and getting through that is what enabled them to be freed up not to work in the long run, and for their spouses not to work, or for their mothers, that is, and for the husband to be the main source of income, because one person going into a factory with a machine eventually became enough to feed an entire household, where it basically got everybody else off the workforce aspect of the family unit where they didn't have to work. So that's kind of what was going on. So when Upton Sinclair is shedding a light on all of this, he really put forth the idea of, without even coming out and saying it, that we needed some sort of regulatory body to manage the hours that people are working in the private sector, and we needed some sort of regulatory body to manage the quality of food coming out of like food plants. So therein lies maybe OSHA, or modern terms FSMA, or the FDA, which all of these organizations are still around. God bless us, I guess, but here we are. So, and then if you look in terms of today, if you're going to go all the way to the opposite side of the spectrum where we're at today, I mean, we also have all of these bevy of EEO laws and other labor laws and opportunities for employees to sue their employer pretty much for any reason under the sun. So what we're coping with today is just a byproduct of what happened back then in the late 1800s and the Upton Sinclairs of the world, and people looking for quick remedies via government intervention or politicians. So I hope that shed a little bit of light of like the history of all this, of kind of how we've gotten to where we are today. So what ended up happening was in the 1910s, 20s, 30s, 40s, we're still being productive as an economy. There's a few world wars, and the world wars really siphoned off all of the productivity and channeled it into the war efforts. And that's why we were so poor at home, and we were rationing, and women were entering the factories and all of these things, the great Rosie the Riveter talk. Well, when the men came back into the family unit and away from the war efforts, that's when the United States saw some of the most incredibly productive years ever since the Gilded Age, debatably the most productive ever. When they came back, laws were still coming up in droves, like I said, and regulations. I mean, currently, present day, I think the U.S. federal government tosses on about 3,000 regulations annually just for the sake of doing it. I mean, there's no real rhyme or reason. They should probably be diminishing 3,000 per year, but what do I know? I'm just this pesky libertarian. But the point is, when people came back from the war efforts in 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, all of that chaos of the world wars ending, basically at that point in time came the Lyndon Johnsons and the Great Society and the war on poverty and the war on drugs, and all of these things are going on culturally. And the next thing you know is what you see is we're going off the gold standard, and we're starting to print money, and we're starting to run deficits, and you're having like a reverse bell curve effect, where basically at one end of the bell curve was the poverty and not so plush of life pre the Gilded Age, and you're ramping up, and all of a sudden you're hitting that bell curve and you're really high on the hog sometime a little bit after the war effort. And then all of a sudden, since then until present day, we've been on this terrible de-escalation or decline, I guess, is what I would say in that regard, and what that is. So basically what that means now is women are forced to work. And I've talked about that in other podcasts now. So it's almost to the point where, like, yeah, men and women, when they have children, it's almost like they basically need their child to work as quickly as possible, not just to pay their way through college, but because it'd be nice for them to have some income in high school to afford some of their other bare necessities, like their own insurances and shit. I mean, this is how bad of a situation we are in the United States right now because of the sheer size of governments and regulations. So there's like the time frame of like the past, 150 years in the United States, and just like the overview of labor laws and the regulatory bodies in the United States. But just looking at it present day, I mean, let's just flesh some of these things out a little bit, like where we are. So you talk about OSHA. I mean, the United States was classic Johnny come lately with OSHA. At the advent of OSHA, workplace accidents, deaths, anything that really occurred in the workplace that was detrimental to someone's body, whether they were developing carpal tunnel, or they blew out of their back, or the hell they even died on the job, all of these instances were plummeting. They were diminishing quickly. And when the United States implemented OSHA, OSHA basically came in and took credit for everything that was going on, as if that was something that just kind of happened because they showed up and they started regulating every company. No, that was something that was by and large already occurring in the United States. That's something you're not going to learn in like your everyday history civics course in high school. You're just not. I mean, that's what was going on. I mean, OSHA basically came in, put a feather in their cap and looked around and said, holy cow, we really saved the day here. Next thing you know, there's not as many people dying on the job and limbs aren't being lost and all of these things. But we know damn well that's not what happened. Libertarians can see right through that. I mean, what happens in the industrial economy is pretty simple. These industrialized economies going forward, what happens is instead of shitting in the street, they're shitting in sewage systems. Instead of dying on the job, they're not dying on the job. Instead of consuming something that has rat poison in it, they're consuming something that's more bountiful and nutritional for you. Nutritious, that is. And the reason these things are happening is not because of some government insight or intervention or oversight or anything. It's because of this is the way of the world. Capitalism, yes, there is some casualties through the developmental process, but 99% of what's going on there is a humongous net positive for everybody. To the extent that they're casualties, they're minimal, while they might look horrible and they're over-sensationalized by the media, it's a lot better than not going through that phase at all because you'd be stuck in really levels of poverty that are known decades previous to this, if that makes sense. So again, another thing that the United States did, it wasn't even just OSHA. I mean, there's other things as well. I mean, right now, the Obama administration, a few years back, instituted FSMA to basically regulate all of the food and beverage manufacturing facilities in the United States, which is pretty much just a bunch of onerous red tape. But I also like to talk about labor laws from the extent that the United States also had people working unlimited, I guess an unfettered amount of hours. People were working 8, 12, 16, 18, 20-hour days, whatever it was, whatever the employer needed. And yes, those things were absolutely happening. It was readily available to see that going on because employers were so productive and had such a demand and were supplying the economy with such a flush amount of goods is that they needed pretty much an unlimited pool of labor. So that didn't mean the employers putting a gun to people's heads saying, we're going to fire you if you don't work 25 hours, because they knew that would run their employees into the ground and probably kill them. So obviously a few employees lost their lives during all this. It's not good. That wasn't the majority of them. So the same type of thing as it pertains to OSHA. As the government came in and claimed, and you look at like the National Labor Relations Boards, they like to take a lot of credit for a lot of this stuff and their administrative agency and the nightmare that is. But it's just funny because the same type of thing, workplace hours and the 5-day work week, these are all, byproducts of the private sector. So yeah, I mean, employers quickly realized that like you can't work someone to death. It's not going to be helpful. It's not going to help your bottom line. So funny how that is. As capitalism kind of made that clear that people should probably get a decent night's sleep or sleep at all. So by the time the government came in and said, you guys could only work 8 hours per day, and to the extent that you work more than that, you need to be paid time and a half. Well, that was already going on, not the time and the half piece, but the idea that people were going to have their hours reduced because it was a more productive workforce and they're implementing shifts. And with these shifts in the factories, they could still run 24/7 and people could get a decent night's sleep. And it just made more sense. And there was a reduction in accidents because people weren't tired or exhausted on the job and they weren't losing limbs as frequently. So all this stuff is playing out. And then, of course, the government comes in, it sets this law, it puts yet another feather in their cap saying, oh, here we are. We saved the day. We took care of this. When in terms of reality, they did not. This was already happening. So we didn't need the 8-hour workday. We didn't need the time and a half policy, because I'll tell you how the time and a half thing hurts poor people presently. So if you have Joe Blow working at a factory, earning a wage, and his employer quickly finds out that, hey, you're working more overtime than I really anticipated. Look, we're going to have to cut you off at 40 hours a week. That's basically all you're going to be able to do. Well, that basically eliminates the opportunity for that employee to say, look, I'll work for the same wage here, just an additional hour or two, instead of him having to actually fucking moonlight and go to another employer, maybe drive a different distance to only get paid that same amount of money or less because he can't get that time and a half where he is because his employer doesn't want to pay him that. So imagine all of the extra productive labor hours out there in the workforce if employers could just pay someone regular time, not time and a half, if it wasn't forced from them. And then imagine all of the cost savings for somebody who didn't necessarily want to go find another job that maybe paid less, or someone didn't want to have to drive some results after work if they were exhausted. They could just stay put for a couple more hours and bang something out for their employer. So the overtime laws actually hurt poor people more than they help them. And that's something that the government would never really talk about. But yeah, that's effectively what moonlighting is. to an extent. I mean, you really can only work a finite amount of hours per day. And why would you want to spend yourself doing 2 commutes or at least 1.5, worth of commutes only because your employer refused to pay overtime? So there's an incentive for employers to kick people out after 40 hours. And that's the same thing for like Obamacare or insurance in general or benefits in general. All these laws are structured in the United States. The idea is that basically employees are only getting part-time hours because when they're part-time associates, a lot of times in these major corporations like retail environments, for example, essentially like all they have to do is employers say, look, if you're a part-time employee, you get no benefits. There you go. Go on to Obamacare, go on to the exchange, which isn't much of an exchange after all. It's actually basically a fucking viper's pit of really priced policies is all it is. So you're really hurting the little man there too by saying, look, you need to basically offer people benefits, employers, if you have them work a certain amount of hours, you have a certain amount of people on the payroll. It's the same thing. I mean, these employers are also basically, in a nutshell, being told if you hire too many people, if you go above and beyond 50 employees, well, then you all of a sudden have to offer this, that, and the other thing. Maybe it's a 401k, it's some sort of retirement package, it's these benefits, it's whatever. And everyone says, well, common sense tells you that's a great thing. Shouldn't employees be happy? Well, that's the ironic part of the entire thing. Employees can't be happy because they're never going to get that, because a company who thinks they can make a lot of money around 50 employees is not going to make that jump to go to 51 because they know they're going to encumber themselves with a ton of expenses. They're going to have to plan this out a few years in advance, their growth plan, if they decide to grow at all. I mean, maybe it's a business owner at the twilight of their career and they're like, I'm just going to hold tight and not grow too much and just kind of cruise out of the revenue I'm earning right now before he kind of divests everything or liquidates all his assets and passes it along to somebody else. Maybe that business is scooped up by a giant conglomerate and they can absorb all the insurance and the benefit offerings the government's forcing them to do. But that's basically what it is. I mean, government is basically saying big companies are the only ones who can comply with these things and small companies are not able to comply. And to the extent they want to comply, they know they have to shell out a lot more money, and it makes them less competitive in the short term. And maybe it makes them hire people at a slower clip. So, I mean, this really hurts employers as well as employees. And then you continue to ask yourself, what else is going on out there in the labor world that makes it so difficult to be a business owner or difficult to be an employee collecting wages or a check from a business owner? And you think of things along the lines of just, simply put, EEO laws. Not to say that discrimination is okay per se, but the idea that an employer should be regulated for any reason, basically upon anyone he hires, regardless of their sex or their gender or their race, their ethnicity. I mean, why does an employer have to regulate any of those things or monitor that or establish certain quotas? I mean, what is the actual point there? I mean, the government wants to come in and say, well, based on your community having, let's say, 50% minorities, you need to hire roughly 50% minorities at your company. Well, what if the 50% minorities at that company have no interest in your business whatsoever and you're barely scraping by to get these people in the door, and to the extent that you're getting them by, they're totally disinterested and they're constantly turning over for whatever reason. Maybe it's part of the culture in the area. Who really knows? So then the employer will get fined because they're not meeting the quota. So it's kind of a fucked up situation. And the opposite there too. What if that some of these protected classes have all this insulation and all of these shields from the government and all of these swords from the government, that is, to sue their employer if they are wrongfully taken advantage of or treated poorly at work? I mean, that basically says employers are like, look, we're hush-hush while we're quoted to do something, or maybe we're not quite big enough to be quoted to do something. Let's just stay that way because we really don't want to hire these certain protected classes because we know they can turn around and sue us. They have the authorization to really cut into our business and our expenses and all of our revenue streams. So let's just keep that in the hush-hush, but let's not really hire any of these protected classes. I mean, these are the conversations employers have behind closed doors because of government. I mean, most businesses care about one thing. It's the color green. You've heard this time and time again. I mean, if they're going to put someone on the payroll, it's usually who does the best job, who's going to deliver the most productivity, who's going to deliver the best results. So looking all over the place, I mean, the history of all this doesn't make sense. It's government constantly being a detriment and a deterrent to society and productivity and hurting the little man. And then you can also look at the minimum wage laws too. I mean, we all know that a business, simply put, I'm going to create a visual for you guys. It's very, very simple. Profits and losses, right? So a business generates revenues all of the time. The revenue minus their operating costs reflects their profits. With their profits, they're able to reinvest in the business, purchase more capital equipment, and then when they purchase this capital equipment, can hire more people. Well, when you're forcing an employer to pay someone a higher wage, you're necessarily lowering the amount of people who are going to be working for your company in general, because let's just say you have a revenue stream of $50 million. And when all is said and done, your operating expenses are about $45 million. So you're left with $5 million of pure profit. If the government comes in and says your company, all of a sudden you need to increase the wages so that maybe $2 million of your profit is the increase across the spectrum for the hike and pay for these people at the bottom rungs of your company's ladder. Well, that basically means with that less profit you have, that means the less capital investment you can make, and that's the less people you can hire. So there's always a trade-off. And I know that's pretty tricky to understand what I just said, so I'm going to try to say that in more layman's terms. I mean, if you have an employer who's basically saying we have all these jobs that deliver $10 per hour of productivity, and we need you to meet that, and someone comes in and they say, well, we can only offer $8 per hour of productivity, well, then let the employer hire them at $8 per hour. That's perfectly fine if they want to do that. I mean, there's a negotiation that has to be had in these situations. It sounds complex and tricky because on the surface it really is, but at the end of the day, I mean, you're basically just raising up that bottom rung. You're eliminating that bottom rung for poor people to get into the company and to develop and acquire skills. So yes, I mean, employers will automate if the minimum wage is too high, and the people who are very, very poor, limited skills will not get hired. So it doesn't make any sense at all. If you completely abolish the minimum wage, well, at that point, anyone can get hired for anything. For Christ's sake, somebody can be hired for $2 an hour to come in there and, I don't know, show their tits to the boss. I have no idea, and leave. I don't really know. I'm not saying any of this shit's moral, but it's just an example. It's like when there's a free-for-all of all these things, people can get paid for God only knows what. It's better than none of these people being able to come out and actually get paid for anything at all because the wage limit is too high. It doesn't make any sense. So from OSHA to FSMA to the FDA to the 8-hour workday to the time and a half to the moonlighting to the EEO laws to not hiring the best person for the job, for the countersuits born out of EEO laws, for the third world countries in present day looking terrible comparing to us, and then people around the world outraged because they look terrible compared to us. Well, just remember where we were back in the day and what got them through that. It was capitalism. So we need to see and advocate for free markets abroad. And that doesn't mean get into our heavy artillery tanks, go over there and blow some people to smithereens. It just means we need free trade and we need these people to have the governments off their back in whatever way, shape, or form that means. And they need to be able to migrate or move or immigrate to other countries who have more capitalistic societies, because those are the ones who are going to prosper, like the United States did back in the Gilded Age, despite some of the things that looked awful, and they were awful. That was a small subset of what was going on in the greater good and for what was more prosperous for the human experience and for mankind as a whole. I mean, the United States was such a fucking powerhouse in that time. And when the people came back from World War II, 60 or 70 years later, after that Gilded Age, I mean, there was times the United States was just crushing it and killing it. It was because they were getting ahead of government's bullshit. But when you get too far ahead of governments, they eventually will shoot you in the back. And they'll come up there and they'll try to find a way to win the race illegitimately. And by doing so, they'll eventually become disqualified. And that's exactly the situation we have here in the United States. The government is disqualifying us every single day, every single week, month, and year from being competitive on the global marketplace. And I give props to the third and second world countries who have had ruthless dictators, bloated, corrupt governments, because those people fighting, sticking up for themselves, and for engaging in free commerce and building business enterprises, those are the ways to succeed and form a more prosperous nation in the long run, while we are doing the opposite here at the home front with all of these labor laws, insulating us from having a productive, wonderful, prosperous future here in the United States. That being said, I've hit my half-hour mark, and thank you very much for listening to a quick overview of labor laws in the United States and how they really fuck everything up. Thank you very much.